Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to do something we haven't done yet on this channel, and that's going to be a mechanical analysis. So we're going to do this live for you guys. This is something we do for all of our in-person and remote athletes, but we're going to break down a big leaguer today. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a mechanical analysis of Carlos Rodon. All right, so for those of you who don't know, he was the third overall pick in the 2014 draft, so a pretty highly touted prospect coming out of NC State. And basically, by the time he got to the big leagues, he had kind of an up and down career for the next few years. And so what we kind of saw is his velocity fell as low as an average of about 91.4 miles an hour in 2019 before getting back up to this year to an average of 95.7 miles an hour. And in that time, we also saw very different pitchers in terms of success, how he was getting hit, and all of that. So if we kind of look at him in 2015, his first year in the big leagues, he's got a 3.75 ERA. He's got a whip around 1.44, and he's giving up 8.4 hits per nine. Okay, so not great numbers, but not bad necessarily. But you can see his whip is kind of high, and he's giving up a pretty fair number of hits per game. And then we go to the next year, 4.04 ERA. The following year, 4.15. Then we get to 4.18 in 2018, just before his velocity dips to its lowest in 2019. And so 2019 and 2020, he had some pretty rough seasons. We got an ERA above 5 and then an ERA above 8. And this is kind of corresponding with this drop in velocity. All right, so we're going to kind of talk about what happened mechanically to lead to this drop in velocity, and then what's kind of happened to kind of take his success to the next level after kind of betting on himself in that 2021 season with the White Sox, where he took a relatively low contract for the type of starter he was projected to be, about $3 million, to where he is now signing that 2-year deal over $20 million a year with the Giants. All right, so let's kind of talk about what changed mechanically and the corresponding velocity increase. Okay, so how did we get from 2019, where his average velocity was 91.4 miles an hour, to 2022, where his average velocity is 95.7 miles an hour, and his top on the season is 100.2. All right, corresponding, having a lot more success on the mound as well. Okay, so one of the first things we can look at is as we get into leg, this is from 2019, all right, so when his velocity was the lowest, what we're seeing is he's very, very upright. We're not seeing any hinge and coil as he goes, right? What we're seeing is he's very knee dominant. That knee's already coming forward. And as that's happening, what's going to happen is his direction is thrown off a little bit there. We're not getting into the hips and utilizing that larger musculature, okay? So very knee dominant. And then we get to this point, and rather than being able to utilize that free energy from the center of mass shift that we get if we're shifting this weight as we're coming down, right? So from here, no real center of mass shift, a slight coil, but not very much of one. We're much more into that knee. Not a lot of coiling going on, not a very good hinge. What's happening is rather than getting the benefit of that free energy from the center of mass shift, almost like if we kind of think about it like a depth jump, where we're getting that kind of kinetic energy from falling, and then we time that with the volitional action of jumping off the ground. It's kind of a similar idea here, right? So we want to take that free energy, and then we get that lower body kind of like a slight push and rotation as we go. What he's doing is he just comes to this point, and then he doesn't have the benefit of that. So rather than being rotational, he pushes, okay? And so we get very pushy, all right, going into foot strike. We get to some kind of triple extendy positions. And then if we view this in 2022, what's happening instead, right? You could see much more into that hip, much more vertical shin here, all right? As we begin moving, he's shifting that center of mass forward, right? Stays into that hip, and that's going to set him up to be very rotational, right? We can kind of see that foot, rather than turning over to this position that we see here, where we're then pushing off the mound, right? We're going from a relative kind of inversion position right here, kind of holding tension in that back hip, to eversion, right? And that sets off rotation there. And that allows us to kind of be more rotational going into foot strike. So we're getting the benefit of the free energy from the center of mass shift. All right, we're being more rotational rather than kind of pushing off, so we're more easily able to kind of segment the lower body and the upper body, right? So we're gonna get the benefit of kind of that elastic stretch across that musculature and those kind of fascial slings, all right? And so big difference between 2022 and 2019, okay? So that's kind of the first thing that we see. Okay, so now we're gonna take a look at his arm action, okay? So he's never had kind of the smoothest arm swing in the world, but one of the things that we've kind of talked about before is the smoothness of that arm swing and how we move to and through these kind of deep end range positions is gonna really determine what kind of output we get from them, right? So we know that the deeper the retraction and horizontal abduction, so when that arm's flipped up, that deeper position we get to, the more stretch we're gonna place on those connective tissues, and so the more kind of reflexive return we're going to get from that pec, the deeper we can get. However, if we muscle our way to that position and just kind of grit our teeth through it, getting that position is not enough. It's about how you get there and how you move through it. And if we can't do it in a relaxed manner, we're not going to get that reflexive return, right? The reflexive return is just that. We're not getting it from muscling up and getting through there. We're getting this elastic kind of involuntary contraction that's happening, and it happens faster and more powerfully than we could get from kind of volitional muscle actions. That's an important thing to remember. And so one of the things that we're seeing in 2022 is a much smoother arm swing. So his hands are about fully broken here, all right, maybe a frame earlier. And then we go to 2019, we see his handbrake is much earlier. Right there, they're starting to break. Okay, and so what happens is when he does that, for him, his arm action already tends to be a little bit stabby, so kind of pushing straight down. He does that here in 2019. You can see he's kind of even curling the wrist there, which is going to make it potentially more difficult to get into good positions kind of going forward after the arm swing. We can kind of talk about that in a minute. But if we see this, then at foot strike, we'll call that foot strike kind of roughly there. We can see the position he's in. And if we compare that to 2022, right, look a little bit looser with the arm swing, and we'll call that's weight bearing right there. That's the position for 2022. All right, so you can see how much more we're getting from this pec here. When we place that stretch, because of how loosely he was able to get there, we're gonna get this really powerful reflexive return. And so even if we take that forward a frame in 2019, we're still not going to get the same return from that, even though we're getting close to the same depth, but how he got there is vastly different. All right, so that stiffer arm action getting to this point is not going to allow the same return that we're talking about in 2022. All right, so a really important thing to remember is how we're utilizing the pec, how we're utilizing the arm swing, and then how we're kind of getting through that position, kind of heading into arm acceleration. Okay, so the next piece of the puzzle here that we're going to talk about is his contralateral tilt, or relative lack thereof, in 2019. And so when we talk about that, it's basically like, how much are you tilting to your glove side, okay? And so it's going to do a couple of things. One, it determines arm slot. So, right, really we should always be kind of getting that arm into the plane of shoulder rotation. So side arm just means basically, right, we don't have any contralateral tilt. Submarine, we have ipsilateral tilt, and then the more over the top we get, whether it's 3/4 or fully over, we're just kind of getting to greater and greater contralateral tilt. But if we're thinking about trying to maximize throwing velocity, contralateral tilt is an important factor. All right, so we know from research that greater contralateral tilt has been associated with higher ball velocity. Okay, and so this doesn't mean you just go all the way there, right? There is kind of a happy medium. Too much of a good thing becomes problematic. But we do know that some contralateral tilt does help to maximize ball velocity. And this makes sense. This is one of the things that kind of Serge Grakovetsky talked about in his spinal engine theory, is that when we get some lateral flexion of the spine, it induces an axial rotation of the pelvis or shoulders, all right? And so what this does is kind of help increase that rotational force and velocity. Okay, so we could see here in 2019, right? Not a ton of contralateral tilt here, all right? So we're not really kind of maximizing that upper torso angular, rotational angular velocity, which we know is the higher that is, the higher the ball velocity is, all right? So we're not maximizing that because we're not becoming as efficient as we possibly can be at rotation by getting a little bit more contralateral tilt. If we then come to 2022, all right, we could see A little bit more contralateral tilt here. You can already see one of the other things is he's getting a little bit later launch. If we see where the ball is being released, this is a little bit more difficult without that kind of first base view, but we can make some inferences here based on kind of what that looks like. But more or less what's happening is in 2022, he's become much more efficient at rotation, and he's increased that rotational angular velocity by adding a little bit of contralateral tilt back in rather than being quite as upright. Okay, so kind of the final piece of the puzzle that we're going to talk about being different between 2019 and 2022 is how far out he gets his torso over that lead leg. So basically, how well is he using kind of that torso flexion piece to this? And he's using it much better in 2022, which we'll look at in just a second. But the reason that's so important is because that gives us a greater distance over which to apply force to the baseball, okay? And so we're maximizing that energy transfer, we're increasing that impulse, all right? And so generally speaking, we're gonna see higher ball velocity, all right? So this is kind of one of the pieces that goes into later launch, right? It's a matter of rotating and flexing through ball release. And this is one of the things that Ron Woolforth has talked about for a long time. And so we could see at ball release, so roughly ball release there, about where he is. And again, difficult without a first base view, but we can kind of see he's maybe slightly out in front of his body, but not very far. If we go to 2022, right, we can see he's kind of already farther out in front. Again, a little bit further in front of his body. Torso's much further out, right? We can see how much more flexion there is here versus in 2019, how much more upright he is. All right, so we're kind of utilizing that spine in more of a bow flex bow manner, which is something that Paul Nyman has talked about, right? So basically how at the leg kick, right, we may have some moderate flexion. At foot strike, we're going to be into relative extension. And then at ball release or going through ball release, we're going to be into more flexion, okay? And so he's using that a lot better in 2022 than he was in 2019. Okay, so all of this kind of begs the question, well, if he was doing, you know, all of these things wrong in 2019, how did he still throw relatively hard, right? I mean, his velocity was at its lowest, and it was still 91.4 miles an hour, with his top being still in the mid-90s, all right? So what was he doing so right? Well, he still utilized his pec much better than many lower-level throwers do. All right, so this is not something you see in generally kind of a lot of high school guys or lower-level amateurs that we'll look at, utilizing the pec as well as he does here. While he's utilizing it better in 2022, he still did a moderately good job here. He also does a moderately good job of kind of segmenting his hips and shoulders. Again, better in 2022 because he is kind of sitting into that hip better. He's utilizing that hinge and coil better, all right? And he's kind of delaying torso rotation a little bit more because he's not so far into that knee. When he's so far into that knee here, he's getting across his body, so it becomes harder to delay that torso rotation and rotate them as two kind of separate segments, whereas in 2022, much easier because his direction isn't quite as challenging, all right? But still did it reasonably well. And then another important piece is he's listed at 6'3", 245. So he's a large human being who's probably also relatively strong, kind of corresponding to that. And then the final piece is he's kind of always had an elite lead leg block. And so all of those things together, we're still going to see pretty good velocity. All right, so we can already see that lead leg working back against the direction of the throw, which we know is kind of the most important factor when it comes to a successful lead leg block inducing the highest possible ball velocity. All right, so this is kind of one of those things. Most pitchers don't actually know what they're truly capable of because they haven't maximized all of the qualities that lead to maximal ball velocity. All right, so they haven't maximized their mobility, their strength, their power, their high velocity force, their mechanical efficiency, all of these things. And these are kind of all areas of opportunity that we look at when we're assessing our athletes. All right, so if you'd like to come in for a mechanical analysis or talk to us about in-person or remote training, feel free to shoot us an email below. If you got something out of this video, please subscribe and share. If you got questions, feel free to leave comments below or shoot us an email, and we'll see you in the next one.